Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies have long been a topic of debate. Many argue about the pros and cons of these digital currencies. The introduction of Bitcoin as a legal tender fuels these discussions even more and makes them all the more present. Although it will take some time for its full impact to be felt, Bitcoin represents a potential solution to global poverty, or the prevailing gap between the rich and poor. In September 2021, El Salvador became the first country in the world to adopt Bitcoin as legal tender. The start of the new currency was definitely bumpy. The country had to deal with various technological problems and an additional slump in Bitcoin's price. Moreover, people are still very suspicious of transactions between dollars and the tiny amounts of cryptocurrencies. Major franchise chains based in the capital have started accepting Bitcoin via smartphone. In addition, the Salvadorian government introduced a network of 200 Chivo ATMs to familiarize consumers with Bitcoin. If President Nayib Bukele's plan to introduce Bitcoin is a success, it is very possible that this change will benefit the impoverished Salvadorian economy. Government officials in El Salvador claim that the introduction of Bitcoin will increase the affordability of services, expand payment options, and increase financial innovation. Success could also encourage other countries to adopt cryptocurrencies, strengthening the possibility of reducing poverty worldwide. Nick Carter of Castle Island Ventures was one of the first to connect with El Salvador's president via social media. He encouraged him to introduce Bitcoin as a means of payment.
You hosted a historic Twitter Spaces last night. You started talking about Bitcoin because that's all you talk about online, and then I think Jack showed up and a bunch of people, and then the president of El Salvador showed up, and you talked, and you single-handedly turned around the coin because now it rallied today. But in your understanding and in your conversation with the president, what is the main benefit to this new law? How will it, in theory, help the economy and the people of the country?
Well, it was a fascinating time because the President Bukele, joined us on Twitter live as this law was being voted in. And we could actually hear the clapping and the votes from the parliamentary chamber to discuss with Bitcoiners on Twitter the merits of the law. The objective seems to be using Bitcoin as a actual medium of payment, medium of exchange, much more frictionless in the country, eliminating all capital gains taxes, which is, of course, a big impediment to actually using this thing as a currency. Potentially in service of making Bitcoin-based remittances cheaper and less frictional, for instance. So that seems to be sort of the main thrust of the law.
What can we extrapolate then as far as what the future holds beyond El Salvador here? Do you think we'll see other, legitimate countries like El Salvador embrace this and other larger countries?
Well, following the Salvadorian news, a number of politicians in Latin America, many of them younger on the millennial side, signaled their affinity for Bitcoin as well, and made noises about potentially introducing similar ideas. We'll see if any of that actually transpires. We know that Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, stablecoins have very high penetration in places like Colombia and Argentina. Latin America is certainly no stranger to sovereign defaults or periods of high inflation or monetary repression. So we see high penetration there. There's certainly a class of policymakers that see an opportunity to gain favor by signaling their affinity. We'll see what happens. But this is El Salvador is the first non-pariah state to really legitimize and legalize Bitcoin usage in sort of its intended way. So, it seems like a big sea change, frankly.
A big sea change that only though meant that we saw a 7% rally. You're still seeing Bitcoin in and of itself under pressure significantly off its highs that we saw previously in the year, Nick. Are you expecting the issue for El Salvador going forward is also the ongoing volatility within Bitcoin as well? Is there any point we're expecting that to just reduce a little bit so we see it more regularly used as a currency, not just by those that are suffering significant inflation or indeed seeing an issue with a hard currency peg?
It's hard to say. Bitcoin's volatility is seen to be as a natural consequence of the scarcity of the system. Of course, something like gold, which is similarly kind of a commodity, fixed in issuance, doesn't evidence such significant volatility. But Bitcoin is still early in its life, and very patchily adopted globally. And also in terms of El Salvador, it's a very small country. Foreign exchange reserves in the single-digit billions. The fund that the President Bukele was talking about establishing, which would hold a position in Bitcoin, he signaled that it would be in kind of the $150 million range, so smaller than many kind of crypto hedge funds. So while this does represent sovereign adoption, it's not sovereign adoption by the largest sovereigns just yet. So we'll see. But in as much as using Bitcoin as a medium of payment or a bridge currency, you don't necessarily have to have exposure to the asset for a long period of time in order to sort of take advantage of its nice properties.
Nick, the Bitcoin community has a history of sort of getting excited about certain people and then they break your heart. Elon Musk is probably the most prominent one, and then he stabbed you in the back. Are you worried that the president won't have a commitment to Bitcoin per se, and next month it's and now we've asked the Ethereum Foundation to digitize health records and XRP to modernize our banking system, and then it'll just be a bunch of crypto buzzwords in a few weeks?
Well, what was notable about this bill that was passed was it specifically says Bitcoin. And all of the messaging is about the Lightning Network and about these payment systems built on top of Bitcoin. And there's relatively little messaging around cryptocurrency more generally. So the commitment in this case does seem to be regarding Bitcoin. Of course, who knows what's going to happen in the future. And in fact, there is going to be plenty of narratives out there around Bitcoiners consorting with someone that is perceived by many in the West as an authoritarian dictator. But any adoption of Bitcoin at the sovereign level is interesting and noteworthy. We don't shy away from that. There has been adoption of Bitcoin by other sovereigns that, are considered pariah states, and nobody tries to hide that. So it's certainly interesting to watch this play out in real time.
In South America, there have already been several hyperinflations in the past. In Venezuela, for example, too many new banknotes are in circulation today, devaluating cash. Unlike the wealthy people of the Western world, people from developing countries are mostly excluded from the benefits of a higher money supply. Their surplus capital is far too small to be invested efficiently. The majority simply do not have the ability to earn enough interest to protect their savings. In this regard, Forbes reported that only about 70% of El Salvadorans are even banked. Bitcoin can help because its supply is finite and therefore limited. According to the Bitcoin Foundation, there will only ever be 21 million Bitcoins. Therefore, when the demand for Bitcoin increases, its value also increases. The limited nature of the currency prevents inflation, helping to reduce global poverty. Unlike most national currencies, central banks cannot control Bitcoin either, as it runs entirely on a decentralized blockchain. There are no transaction fees, which helps poorer people in developing countries to increase their return on investment without additional fees. Cryptocurrencies allow even the poorest people to make investments over which they have full control. Since cryptocurrencies prevent outside interference in investments, they create a level playing field for everyone. That the introduction of a digital currency can indeed have positive effects on the stability of a country is shown by the example of Venezuela. The start of Valiu is helping the people of Venezuela in their fight against hyperinflation.
I'm Simon Chamorro. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Valiu, and we're a product that helps Venezuelans living in hyperinflation protect their money from losing value, receive remittances, and pay locally to buy food and medicines. Both businesses and consumers are able to exchange goods and services with each other, paying in cryptocurrency. The vision for us is to increase economic freedom.
Venezuela is known for its political and economic instability. Hyperinflation has caused the bolivar to lose 99.9% of its value in just 2 years. Wealthy Venezuelan families saw their fortunes disappear, and the poor were pushed even further into desperation. Simon Chamorro knows this story all too well.
Growing up in Venezuela, essentially whatever my dad and my mom were able to build during their life was lost. When the economy started to fail, we, for example, had water shortages or like electricity blackouts across the country. Money was starting to get hyperinflated. This is not like a sad story that I'm trying to tell. This is the reality of most Venezuelans. More than 99% of the Venezuelans lost everything they've built because the country failed. All of the Venezuelans' savings of most middle-class people went to zero. I knew I wanted to build something. I had to find my purpose. I always knew I wanted to start a company and to build things, which is the reason why I studied industrial design with the hypothesis that I was going to be able to build things. I didn't pursue that career, but I learned a lot of things that got me into tech. So I found crypto through tech. I felt passionate about the technology, and then when I understood the potential of crypto, I realized that Venezuela is potentially the best place to do this at a massive scale. The reality is, if we deconstruct cryptocurrencies, the most basic thing is that it helps disintermediate, and this may have the possibility to change society as we know it. The main problem Venezuelans are going through right now is hyperinflation. Hyperinflation is just a byproduct of total mismanagement of the country.
Venezuela's descent into an impoverished dictatorship put the devastating effects of hyperinflation on full display for the world to see. Lines for basic needs, extreme shortages of food and medical supplies, civil strife, violence. And the citizens spared were the ones who could move their currency out of Venezuela to other more stable currencies like the US dollar, a luxury mostly saved for the ultra-elite. But Simon's platform Valiu promises the opportunity for everyday Venezuelans to protect themselves from hyperinflation by way of cryptocurrency. And according to him, the unstable conditions of his country are the perfect breeding ground for such an experiment.
Nobody trusts the currency or the government. People are looking for solutions. In a place where people are trying to survive, the barrier of trying new things is much lower. So digital dollars, stablecoins, cryptocurrencies, people are going to be willing to try it with a little bit of money and then slowly kind of get there. Our main objective right now as a company is to enable merchants to accept digital dollars as a medium of payment, and so people have to use the Bolivar less and less. We're focused on building a product that serves from the richest person with a lot of education and technical literacy, from the lowest income person with very low education and low technical literacy. In a country like Venezuela, where the minimum wage is $1, you have a situation where most people are starting their own little business, selling hot dogs or selling the local food called arepas or whatever they do, but they sell it to their community. And you have these hyper-local communities, so we want to help them accept payments in dollars, in digital dollars, stablecoins, and then onboard users. The more consumers that pay in dollars, the better for the merchants. The more merchants that accept it, the better for the consumer. So far, we've moved millions of dollars. We've helped more about than 150,000 households, 30,000 monthly active users, and it's working. The reality is that economic freedom, it's only directly tackled by the innovation that is cryptocurrencies.
But we can't forget that Venezuela has tried this already. El Petro was a proposed cryptocurrency backed by the country's most abundant resource, oil. While El Petro was widely considered a resounding failure, many experts agree that the experiment was a necessary step in establishing cryptocurrency for the future. And Simon is convinced that its foundations, namely blockchain technology, remain stronger than ever and ready for another, more practical iteration.
Blockchain is really a paradigm shift for the human race. It's one of the most important things that has happened in recent history. What you're starting to see is companies starting to completely build their products on top of this blockchain. It's almost like it's creating its own economy. If there's a way to provide more stability and economic freedom and financial freedom to Venezuelans without crypto, I would rather for that to happen than for me to be successful with a product that doesn't bring value to the people.
Bitcoin operates outside the current financial system. That is, there is no central authority, since it is not yet possible for governments and banks to interfere with Bitcoin transactions. This means that people cannot be discriminated against when using the currency. Cryptocurrencies are also very secure and difficult to steal, which further limits potential corruption. One problem with external aid, however, is making sure that the money ends up in the hands of those who desperately needs it. For example, much of the $130 billion that the United States has paid to Afghanistan since 2001 has been diverted by Afghan leaders. Corrupt governments that claim such aid for themselves are a particularly common problem with several African countries. The use of Bitcoin and its ability to prevent corruption can help reduce this problem.
Do you doubt that the U.S. will make a similar move? What's your take?
Well, I think what we've really seen now is quite a few projects underway, both in the US and abroad, where central banks are beginning to explore the development of their own digital currencies. So we've seen that in places like China. We've seen the development of the digital dollar project beginning to get some traction here in the US. But ultimately, this is not necessarily something that should be construed or understood to be a competitor with decentralized protocols like Bitcoin. But rather, I do see in the future that we will see sovereign currencies, fiat currencies, do make the move onto a blockchain-based system.
So how is this uncertainty impacting where you're placing your bets? I mean, do you have any plans to pitch a tent on Bitcoin Beach in El Salvador anytime soon?
I think this has been a really interesting time in the market. Seeing moves like what we're seeing in El Salvador, seeing an environment where we have some of the world's most followed, most famous investors publicly coming out in support of Bitcoin, seeing, major corporations begin to add Bitcoin to their balance sheets. This is an environment unlike we've ever seen before around this asset class. And I certainly think the last 18 plus months for many people in the investment community have really solidified the staying power that digital currencies now have, and investors are now waking up to the potential that they can provide to their portfolios.
Now, I just spoke with Coinbase co-founder Fred Ursum of the crypto venture capital firm Paradigm, who's legitimately concerned that China will surpass the US in crypto, and especially when it comes to regulation. What do you think?
Well, I think what we're seeing here in the US is a regulatory regime that has been very in tune with cryptocurrency. And, certainly firms like Grayscale are a really strong example of a firm that's working within the asset class, but also within the existing regulatory framework. And what you're seeing is now guidance that has really given investors the confidence they need to approach and be involved in the asset class, whether it's SEC, CFTC, IRS, Treasury, FinCEN, you name it. And what we have seen in other parts of the world, like China, is a stance that I think is a little bit more prohibitive at times around decentralized currencies like Bitcoin. So, to Fred's point, and I do sometimes agree with that stance, that there is a little bit of, perhaps an arms race around this as to which countries and which regulatory regimes are going to be most accommodative to the innovation that's taking place around these types of assets, and ensuring that the companies and the people that are using them, kind of get that first mover advantage. So there is some element of time being of the essence around some of those initiatives.
Well, and speaking of that, we're expecting an SEC decision in the near future on Bitcoin ETFs. That decision was expected this week. It was pushed. Where do you expect that decision to land?
Well, we've been engaged with the SEC on Bitcoin ETFs dating all the way back to 2016. We are 100% committed to converting our flagship fund, Grayscale Bitcoin Trust, into an ETF. when the regulatory environment is ready to make those kinds of approvals. And from our engagement with regulators and our seat within the financial services and crypto communities, we're really encouraged by a lot of the progress that's being made. But I think the SEC has been very, very clear that there are certain aspects of the crypto ecosystem that they're looking to achieve a certain level of maturation. And so they're trying to ensure that these markets, and inherently before they approve products around them, are void of manipulation, have surveillance sharing agreements in place in the spot market, and ultimately may have some of the same types of investor protections in place that they may have around equities and other asset classes that they also oversee. So while we're certainly making progress, I think clearly we're not quite there just yet.
Now, obviously, there's been a ton of volatility. Are we back on the upswing, or are we going to see some more lows before we get back to a high up cycle?
Well, I think based on investor demand, we've seen this time and again. We've seen either leverage coming out of the ecosystem that's caused a correction in the price of Bitcoin, or other news or other events affecting the price of Bitcoin. But typically the investor behavior has been one of using these pullbacks in price opportunistically to add to their positions, right? If they fundamentally still believe in the same investment thesis, but that investment is now available to them at 10 or maybe 15% cheaper than it was a week or two or a month ago, then investors often use these types of periods of time to really add to those positions and ultimately build a diversified portfolio, when you see those pullbacks.
What do you think of Elon Musk's latest comments? I mean, does the whiplash bother you, saying one thing then saying another?
Well, you're talking to someone that's been around crypto for about 8 years now. And so I've seen no shortage of movements in the crypto price. But I do think some of the commentary that Elon Musk has made has really been focused on ESG and some of the carbon footprint and energy consumption concerns around Bitcoin mining. And I think when it comes to that, it's really important that we stick to the facts. I think the latest statistic is about 75% of miners are using renewable energy as part of their energy mix. So that could be hydro, that could be wind, it could be solar. And it's important to zoom out a little bit, Emily, and realize we're only 10 or 12 years into the life cycle of crypto assets. And so it definitely stands to reason that this is an opportunity for this industry to continue to innovate, continue to reduce its carbon footprint, and ultimately kind of rise to the challenge that's being presented to it.
How should we think about this then? The biggest test for Bitcoin being adopted as legal tender?
This is an exciting moment for the cryptocurrency community because, of course, this is what they said will happen, right? I mean, El Salvador, it's not at the center of global finance, but still, this is the first test for Bitcoin. They will be very excited about this, and this isn't something that has ever been done before. So just for that reason, I think this is very exciting.
Yeah, Mark, jump in.
How much of a worry are we that this is going to be a buy the rumor, sell the fact event? El Salvador only has 400 Bitcoins. It's not very much. So, $20 million worth. What's the expectation from here?
I think that is a risk. And there was this push from the Reddit and Twitter community to say, look, let's go out and buy Bitcoin on the 7th of September, on today, so that they can get out there and push the price higher. But I mean, we've already seen the price rally 40% since that announcement was made. So I think there is a risk here that, the air gets let out of the rally somewhat. I do think, however, that there's a lot of exciting things happening right now in the crypto space. And one of them is also a US ETF potentially coming. So there's just signs that it is being adopted more widely, and I think that will be exciting for the crypto.
Now, paint a picture for us, Eddie, as to what it really means if a country adopts this as their currency, because I was looking at photos of cash points.
Right.
But you go to the cash point to change your Bitcoin into dollars, so you still spend US dollars on the street. Is that how this still works?
Well, it's a two-tier system in El Salvador. What they want most people and big retailers to accept Bitcoin, so you would be able to go there and use your cryptocurrency wallet and pay directly. but then also for smaller retailers that are not able to do so, they will be exempt. But for the most part, I think most retailers will have to accept it. It's worth noting that it is not a very popular law in El Salvador. Surveys have shown that a lot of people want to see this repealed, but there are good reasons for this, particularly around remittances.
Thank you very much, Eddie. Really good to get your perspective on these stories. Eddie van der Veld joining us there from the Markets Live team.
Bitcoin and the world of cryptocurrencies continue to be a much discussed topic as more and more people around the world become interested in their potential. For people and countries that lack financial stability, cryptocurrencies could be a viable solution. With its ability to stop corruption, prevent discrimination, and avoid inflation, Bitcoin has the potential to have a major impact on global poverty. Brock Pierce, chairman of the Bitcoin Foundation, spoke in an interview about Bitcoin's continued growth and current problems. This is because, especially for people in rural areas, it is mostly impossible to make digital transactions even today.
Brock, you were mentioning that you've worked with so many other countries as well. You've spent time in El Salvador. Can you talk to us a little about what you're hearing in terms of other countries that are thinking of adopting this by way of El Salvador as well?
Well, seeing how big a massive success this El Salvador launch has been in terms of the impact it's having on financial inclusion, I'd say a lot of governments are curious. Obviously, I'm not here to make decisions or advise them per se on what to do. I'm there to give them the information so that they can make decisions in terms of what they think is best for their country. But I'll tell you, there's a lot of interest. There is a lot of curiosity. I've got, I think, 35 presidents in a queue right now. I literally can't move around the world fast enough to give them all of the information that they need. And I'm meeting with the ministers, the heads of the central banks. I'm meeting with the business leaders, the banks, the private sector. There is a great deal of interest because of the things we talked about. And now that there is a success, and data doesn't lie, I think that this is going to be a trend. I think that you're going to see a lot more adoption and acceptance from governments around the world, especially in the emerging markets.
Brock, I'm really curious about what you think of this idea of so many people not even having access to 5G internet and mobile services. I mean, there's still a barrier here to get access to Bitcoin as a currency if you don't have the infrastructure to do that. And that's a problem here as well as in emerging markets. How do you think about that issue when we're transforming this economy to a digital economy?
So you need connectivity. It doesn't need to be, 5G. But yes, there is a problem of connectivity around the world. It's not in cities. It's typically in rural areas because it's expensive using land-based connections to reach people where there's small populations. From a business perspective, it's not profitable. Now, the good news is with things like Starlink and satellite systems, using air and space, we are finding mechanisms or methods of delivering connectivity to rural areas, and we are not that far away from everyone having access. So it's coming. It's a separate lane in terms of major problems in the world that need to be solved. But the good news is it is being solved.
But the launch of the world's largest cryptocurrency got off a bumpy start in El Salvador. Bitcoin plunged about 17% within an hour, falling to nearly $43,000 before recovering about half its losses. The Bloomberg Galaxy Crypto Index, which lists some of the largest digital coins, lost as much as 19% at times. The reason for this, according to Stefan Oulet, managing director and co-founder of FRNT Financial, was mysterious sell-offs or sell-offs for which a legitimate reason is only found after a considerable amount of time. These are much more common with cryptocurrencies than with other asset classes. The crypto market remains far more opaque and global than most, if not all, other asset classes. Billionaire Mike Novogratz, Chief Executive Officer of Galaxy Digital Holdings and a longtime crypto enthusiast, said the market for digital currency, and coins in particular, has been surging and oversold over the past 8 weeks. Interest from individual investors has skyrocketed due to large institutions now investing in cryptocurrencies.
Mike, you are known to buy the dip. So what are you buying and how much of it?
Well, listen, I think there's been a big sell-off today. I think we always have to remember that crypto is still a retail-dominated ecosystem, right? We've had institutions that are moving in by the day, and that's creating a lot of excitement. But there's lots of retail money. A lot of it's leveraged. There was about $4 billion of liquidations that happened in a short period of time this morning, right? That's mostly leveraged offshore in places like FTX and Binance. And the market got too long. It got long for good reasons, right? I think in the last 8 weeks, there has been a giant realization that crypto is not just Bitcoin being bought as a hedge against bad monetary and fiscal policy, but maybe more importantly, it's Web 3.0. It's the Internet of Value Transfer. And when you see companies like Visa buying an NFT and saying they think digital goods is a big part of their future, Walmart and Amazon, the two biggest retailers in the world, putting up help wanted signs for crypto engineers and for crypto experts. There's a realization that this is a technology play. And no investor wants to miss the next internet. This is the next internet. And so there was a lot of great price movement, right? We went from 29,000 to 53,000 in Bitcoin, and from whatever 1,800 all the way to 4,000 in Ethereum. Solana, a new level 1 for most institutions, has burst onto the scene. And so I think we just got too excited, and this was a little air being popped out of the balloon.
All right, Mike, we do want to get your thoughts on Solana, but before we move on to that, I am just curious as to what role, if any, governments then will have in this, because the El Salvador approach was, of course, much more just straight transactional, and we've seen sort of some of the concerns as to sort of gravitating to a transactional model for Bitcoin and other crypto assets here. With other governments decide to get into this, what role do you think they would play in this environment?
There's two different sides to this, right? Governments are going to be very, very protective of their national currencies, right? Their ability to tax and print currencies is tantamount to them existing in lots of ways. And so I think they'll be okay with payments. You're going to see the rise of stable coins, right? China's issuing one. You'll see them in almost every major country. Basically wrapped versions of those national currencies. And I think things like Bitcoin, which in the West really are being used as store of value, people aren't using it as a transactional currency. I think what's unique in El Salvador is, 20% of their GDP comes from remittances. And so you can see lots of those remittances, people sending Bitcoin back across oceans from the US to El Salvador. And the locals either keeping it in Bitcoin because they're worried about the dollar. Remember, they have a dollarized economy, or converting it and spending it in the local economy. And so, they're kind of unique in that respect. And we'll see. Maybe it gets used as a transactional currency. I've never thought it would be, partly because I think it's going to keep going higher. And why would you spend something that's going to keep going higher?
Well, could you argue, though, why would you spend on something on days like today where 10 minutes later it drops 10%? Could you make the case that, like you were hinting at,
Taylor, if you're such a good trader, you know what time to buy the pizza and what time to pay in Bitcoin and dollars, I should hire you. Listen, it's really difficult to understand in the short term where markets are going. In the longer term, it's not so difficult. Just look at a 15-year or a 12-year log chart of the Bitcoin price and think about the adoption that is happening all over the world. It is now an asset. It's a store of value. I like to kid when Stan Druckenmiller said it was an asset. He's literally the best investor we've seen in 30 years. It's an asset. And so there are enough Stan Druckenmillers, there are enough institutions that have said they believe in this as a store of value, that it is a store of value.
Mike.
And therefore, I just see it heading one direction.
The rollout today for El Salvador is choppy. There's a price drop. There was technology glitches at the beginning. BitGo, which you've agreed to buy, is a company that is working with El Salvador. What do you make of today's rollout, and what impact might it have on future countries that may choose to go this route? Venezuela, for example, comes to mind when a lot of people talk about this.
Listen, no matter whatever you're doing a new technology rollout, there are glitches. And so I guess the real question is come back in 6 weeks or 12 weeks and let's talk about how it's working, for the people of El Salvador, for the system itself. I remember when Obama rolled out Obamacare, and it was kind of a disaster for a little while, and they sorted the glitches out. Doing things at scale is not easy. And so I've got a lot of faith that they'll get this right.
The other thing is that we're in a place where you see these young traders moving to the market across the world, and you see them buying NFTs, you see them buying meme stocks for the last few months. What's the next big thing that you think that the retail trader could catch on to?
Great question. Listen, I think what the lesson that we should learn from this year is that there are so many eyeballs out there, right? And the faster you can see something that catches those eyeballs and builds community, the faster the price moves. And so it literally is watching for what the next idea is. And then those communities become much stronger than I ever thought they'd be, right? I used to think, okay, Bitcoin will work, and the cryptos that get a lot of use, like Ethereum, things building on it, or even Solana, lots of people are now building on it, would work. But some of these other things wouldn't. They wouldn't have a purpose. And I've just been wrong, right? You look at Cardano or XRP. They have these fan clubs, these very committed investors who are bringing people into their community, and really it's a sense of identity. And so I think what we're learning is the internet and retail interest has created almost a new way to think of investing. It's, can they build a community? Can they make it sustainable with, bringing more people in? And when money's cheap and there's so much money floating around, we're seeing, things that I never thought would happen. I mean, GameStop, AMC, perfect examples of stocks that now that trade completely divorced from the fundamentals of the company. And you're seeing that same thing in crypto.
So when we talk about sort of the way some investors gravitate to things, Mike, I mean, you mentioned Solana a couple times here. We talk about the token sort of tied to that, and just how fast it sort of vaulted itself into sort of public consciousness here. I'm curious as to what you think is driving that, and about the sustainability of some of these moves here, because that always seems to be the question people have, particularly people new to this. They sort of look at the volatility and they wonder, where is this sustainable?
Well, you look at Sam Bankman-Fried, who runs FTX, who's 30 years old, who just raised $900 million for his company at $18 billion valuation from some of the best investors in the world, right? He's a legend in this space, and he's the backer of Solana. And so that's his ecosystem. So people are betting on Sam. As more people come in, they get excited, right? Institutions are coming in. And it hit a critical point of acceleration, where now it's a thing. What's a blockchain? A blockchain is a database that we all share. Solana is exciting because it's easier to build on because it's really fast, right? It's faster than Ethereum. It's faster because it's not nearly as decentralized. It's not nearly as secure and safe in some ways, right? There's only, a couple dozen validators of the Solana blockchain, where there's thousands on the Ethereum blockchain. Right now, consumers don't seem to care, right? It's decentralized enough. And regulators don't seem to care. There is a fair question. Will, in time, regulators say, we're not going to let this business infrastructure for our country or the world be built on blockchains that aren't decentralized? Like, that's up for grabs. That's really in the weeds. Right now, that's not what the market's focused on. The market's focused on fast is better, and can they get people to build on it, and is there excitement around it? And so, Luna is another blockchain that I have big investments in, full disclosure.
Okay.
Juan from Korea, he's like the Sam Bankman-Fried. He's pulling all kinds of products and projects into his ecosystem.
Mike, unfortunately, I have to be sort of the boring one that brings us back to macro. I am wondering your call on rates. Are you still short? You betting rates to climb from here?
I am short rates. Listen, they've had a decent little move recently. Rates higher, prices lower. I just think it's impossible to own as much crypto as I do, or other assets, equities, and not want to have a big rate short. There is a possibility that inflation is much stickier than we think and accelerates, and that the Fed will have to move sooner than they think, and more aggressive when they move. They might not. If they don't, I think assets keep going up for a long period of time, right? As long as cow keeps easy money, you can stay long your assets. But it feels like it's a really important hedge for any portfolio that's asset heavy.
While the launch in El Salvador may have been a possible cause of the fluctuations in Bitcoin, other variables in the notoriously volatile crypto sector may also be at play. The Central American country's president, Nayib Bukele, shared on Twitter that the digital wallet used for the project can now be downloaded after previously being shut down due to technical issues. Kivo is a Bitcoin wallet that allows Salvadorian citizens and businesses to send or receive payments in Bitcoin or dollars anywhere in the world. With Kivo, Bitcoins can be automatically converted into US dollars. Also, people in El Salvador can use it to withdraw Bitcoin holdings or cash at Bitcoin ATMs. El Salvador has used the US dollar as its national currency since 2001, when it switched from the colon currency, which has issued in 1982. The main service provider of the Kivo wallet is reportedly Mexico-based exchange Bitso, which is one of the largest cryptocurrency exchanges in Latin America. Bitso is working with the US Federal Reserve member Silvergate to facilitate US dollar transactions for the wallet. Emily Chang was in conversation with FalconX's Anya Kantorovich and Bloomberg News' Michael McDonald to discuss first impressions of the Bitcoin rollout in El Salvador.
What does this mean for Bitcoin? What does this mean for El Salvador?
Yeah, well, as you mentioned today, it became legal tender in El Salvador. So what it means for Bitcoin is there are businesses in El Salvador that will be required to accept this if they're technologically able. We've seen several businesses today start to accept it in El Salvador. A lot of the larger ones, McDonald's, Pizza Hut, Starbucks. We've seen transactions in Bitcoin go through at some of these larger chains in El Salvador. Also, citizens in El Salvador, if they want, they can pay their taxes in Bitcoin as well. So, it did become legal tender. It is going to operate alongside the dollar for now in El Salvador. So the dollar will still be a national currency there as well. So if people don't want to use Bitcoin, they can use the dollar as well. But businesses will be required to accept it if they are technologically able as of today.
That said, with the president saying to buy the dip, the technical glitches, Aya, should we be at all skeptical of what's happening here?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, it will take time. I agree with what Mike Novogratz said, that this is going to take a lot of time. The infrastructure in order to accept these payments at scale will take significant manpower and time and investment as well. And I think while they're putting into place thousands of ATMs, the payment processors in all of these different businesses will take time. But I think for a country, taking a step back from what Michael said, even around some of those larger companies, for a country where a quarter of their GDP is based on remittances, I think this is much larger in terms of the impact it can have on the population and their ability to move money across borders that perhaps they can't today, but could if they just had a mobile device.
That said, the population isn't necessarily too excited about it. Michael, I've seen polls that show a lot of distrust among folks who live in the country. How widespread is that, and could that really slow down broader adoption?
Sure, yeah, we've seen polls in the weeks leading up to this that about 70% of El Salvadorans prefer to use the dollar to Bitcoin. And we've also seen that about 70% have said that they would like to see this Bitcoin law repealed. So there is quite a bit of skepticism of it on the ground. I also think there's a pretty large financial education learning curve. El Salvador is not a country that has a lot of its citizens using the traditional banking system. It's cash is still king in El Salvador. So when you bring in this sort of new technology like cryptocurrency, there is sort of a hesitancy and there is sort of some pushback at first. So we are seeing a lot of people that are skeptical on the ground. There were a lot of questions this morning with the Chivo wallet. People couldn't download it. It was offline for a little while, so the government could fix some glitches. So it was a little bit of a rocky start, and there is some skepticism in El Salvador.
That said, Aya, we've learned that we can never judge Bitcoin on any given day. But what do you make of what's behind this price move? How much does this have to do with El Salvador, or is it something else?
Yeah, good question. So it had nothing to do really with El Salvador. What we saw today was very much what we saw historically with BitMEX liquidations. And so you're seeing over the last couple of weeks, a lot of whether it's retail and institution on overseas exchanges pile into derivatives products for futures in products that maybe they didn't necessarily know or were funding correctly. And there was a leverage waterfall. And so cascading liquidations happened this morning. Now, what really interesting is that this was very much like a bullish bear day. And so we saw that bounce back really quickly. So as was discussed earlier, we dropped down to 44. We're now at a support level of 47. I still think we're very much nearing that 60K mark. And so we're continuing to see a lot of, I think of the 2.6 billion in liquidations, 1.1 billion was in Bitcoin, 700 million was in Ethereum. And this was largely driven by Ethereum and DeFi assets. So still very bullish on long-term view for price on Bitcoin.
If you're that optimistic, when do we get to 60K? And also, we've had the co-founder of Kraken on the show who say we're going to get to 100 before the end of the year. Would you agree?
Yeah, so may not agree with Jesse on that. He's very bullish, but you know, that's a good question. I think we'll see it in the next couple of weeks. Really, what pushed us beyond 50K wasn't the leverage on Bitcoin. It was people, you know, accumulating Bitcoin at spot and buying it in size. And what we were seeing at FalconX, at least today, is a lot of these institutions took the opportunity to buy the dip. At not only Bitcoin, but across different assets. And so I think we'll see that 60K sooner than we expect, I think, in the next couple of weeks.
The pro-Bitcoin government under President Bukele announced that his country will respond to the recent price drop by buying 150 more coins at an average price of just over $48,500. It is safe to say that El Salvador is one of the countries that is very positive towards Bitcoin, as it has summarily legalized the primary cryptocurrency. Since then, the president, Nayib Bukele, and his government has taken over every opportunity to further capitalize on opportunities in the market, such as the plan to use BTC profits to build schools and a veterinary clinic. Just recently, Bukele's announced plans to build a Bitcoin city and invest an additional $500 million in the value of security through a special bond.
Off to a little bit of a rocky start as the price on Bitcoin itself crashed, and the country, of course, had a little bit of trouble rolling out that payment system. Joining us right now to talk a little bit more about this is Bitcoin enthusiast Joe Weisenthal, who, of course, has been following this rollout for us. Joe, obviously, you do a lot more than that, but you certainly know a lot, not only about Bitcoin, about this whole ecosystem here.
Yeah.
I'm just curious as to what you generally expected from the start of a country, even though it's a small country, using this as legal tender.
You know, it's hard for me to imagine that the existence of another currency will itself amount to this big transformation. But it would not surprise me if at the margins, or maybe to a substantial degree, it does bring in foreign direct investment. Obviously, a lot of actual Bitcoin enthusiasts, investors, technologists in the space are very excited about what's going on there. And so the idea that perhaps they could set up shop in the country as miners, developers, and so forth, perhaps also Bitcoin tourism, it would not be surprising if one effect is to essentially bring in more outside capital.
We know, obviously one of the most important things here will be for other countries thinking about this, Joe, some of the learning that happens here. What are you watching most closely? What do you think will be most interesting about how this works and who uses it and what the challenges are?
Well, I think it'll be really interesting to see, a few things. One is, do people use it as a spending currency, or, most people in the U.S. and developed markets who own Bitcoin mostly own it as an investment, so that'll be interesting. There's also interesting technological questions, the degree to which people find it easy to use the various solutions that are being developed, whether it's the government's wallet or another wallet. That'll be really interesting to watch because that might inform whether other countries try to adopt something similar. So I guess just usage patterns in general, what apps and how, whether it's spending, investment, those will all be interesting things to track.
All right, I want to bring in Nick Carter, partner at Castle Island Ventures. Nick hosted a chat on social with the president of El Salvador, encouraging him to adopt Bitcoin not long before the country did exactly that. So, Nick, we won't say that it was your brainchild, but certainly you were part of the conversation with the leadership there. What are you watching most closely here now that they have taken this step?
Well, I'm curious to see the extent to which second layer networks like the Lightning Network actually get utilization. Apparently, it looks like the official Chivo app will support this overlay network. And so I'm very curious, as Joe says as well, to see whether Salvadorans actually embrace Bitcoin as a medium of exchange.
Yeah.
So far, the evidence is that Salvadorans are mostly bemused about the move, but it'll be very interesting to see if they actually use it at merchants.
Well, that's what I'm curious about, Nick. I mean, obviously there's the Bitcoin faithful, and then you have some institutions that see the investment opportunity within it. But of course, trying to convince just average people on the ground to use this in a transactional way has to be a bit of a hard sell. And we've seen some data showing polling out of El Salvador saying something like 70% of the public doesn't really want this thing. How do you overcome that? How does this country sort of mount that type of public perception in opposition to something that they seem to be tethering their future to?
Well, I'd be surprised if Bitcoin became the dominant medium of exchange in the country. I expect dollars to be the predominant solution for the foreseeable future. It is a little bit surprising that the Bukele administration has pushed Bitcoin as a medium of exchange so firmly when at the sovereign level, it seems like the most obvious thing to do would be to adopt it, in their foreign exchange reserves as kind of a gold-like analog. Whereas at the brick and mortar merchant level, Bitcoin is not a popular tool, nor has it really ever been. So it's a little bit surprising to me to see their emphasis in sort of, that transactional mode.
Nick, what do you see as the upside scenario here for? So obviously, look, a lot of Bitcoiners such as yourself have been very enthusiastic, very excited about this news. What does success look like, either for Bitcoin or, more importantly, what do you think if success could mean for El Salvador?
Well, for El Salvador, they're going to have to normalize their relations with the international institutions like the IMF. There's a lot of uncertainty that they need to be resolved. Investors in Salvadorian debt are pretty concerned. And so I'd like to see yields come down a little bit. But generally speaking, I think a relatively smooth rollout. The Chivo wallet appears to be working. It's in the App Store. So sort of in theory, it works. It would be, I think, damaging to the effort if the Bukele administration started to enforce Article 7 in the law really aggressively against merchants that didn't offer Bitcoin, transaction settlement. So as currently conceived, this law is actually more of a forced tender than a legal tender law, and it actually mandates merchant acceptance. If they start to enforce that really aggressively, I think that would be a pretty significant optics blow for the Bukele administration. It might trickle down to Bitcoin as well.
Nick, obviously there would be a lot of kind of process learning here, but in terms of sort of the argument for the possibility, it's there. What would you expect to see larger countries, more kind of globally integrated countries, adopting Bitcoin in the same way anytime soon?
Perhaps not embracing it as this medium of exchange, which, as I've said, is a curious approach, but as a sort of non-sovereign digital gold-like asset that you can hold and use to diversify your exposure away from sovereign currencies like the dollar. To me, that seems like the most obvious approach. El Salvador, to be clear, is probably not the first sovereign state to hold Bitcoin on its balance sheet. It's certainly rumored and quite plausible that states like Iran, Venezuela, or North Korea all hold Bitcoin in some capacity. They're the first ones to do it explicitly, though. But yeah, as Bitcoin becomes more of this gold-like asset and fully undertakes that process of maturity and financialization, that's where I'd expect to see uptake. As central banks potentially look for this sort of non-sovereign asset that they can hold.
But just to be clear, Nick, so when you talk about uptake, you're talking about these central banks sort of building that up in its reserve, or the Treasury in its reserves, to a level that I guess would maybe by default just sort of force uptake?
Yeah, that's what I would expect to see in terms of sovereign adoption of Bitcoin. None of us really expected that the first nation to fully embrace Bitcoin would do it in terms of encouraging it to become a dominant medium of exchange.
So do you think there's going to be another country? I mean, actually, more importantly, like Bitcoin hasn't gone anywhere in a long time, price-wise. It went down quite a bit since the highs earlier in the spring. Then it's bounced back. Like, what is the next big catalyst you're watching for? Was it more on the national side? Is it something on an ETF? Like, what do you think is going to be the next thing that gets people excited about Bitcoin? Because even with the recent crypto rally, it seems like people are really more excited about like Solana or like buying a JPEG of an ape.
Well, you have to consider it in context, and I think it's those macroeconomic drivers that are really going to determine the next few years of Bitcoin's future effectively. If we get this kind of sustained monetary repression with negative real interest rates, I think assets like Bitcoin continue to look attractive to investors. Bitcoin itself doesn't really have to change much. It's sort of quite well understood. And of course, there's things like an ETF, which would be further financialization, make it suitable for other market participants to get exposure to. But that's pretty incremental at this point. I think it really just depends what's happening out there in sort of the broader macroeconomic environment.
We know that there is, plenty of review happening at the SEC and elsewhere from a regulatory point of view about cryptos in general and their use and their applications. What do you think? Where do you think we are, and how does this, if in any way, change the thinking by the SEC, for instance, in the legitimacy of these products and how they will be used by perhaps even the Federal Reserve?
Well, SEC Chairman Gensler understands Bitcoin very well, and I think his opinion of it is sort of fully complete. And he's, I think carved it out as something that's truly decentralized. He's made statements to that effect. Now, the remainder of the crypto space, especially decentralized finance, some of these crypto banks, lenders, seem to be in his crosshairs. I think the SEC is a more activist SEC. It's just fundamentally more active than the prior SEC, and has a number of sort of litigations undergoing, including with Ripple. And Gensler has made some pretty direct and aggressive statements about the decentralized finance space. And I think the whole industry is kind of expecting some sort of reprisal there, although we don't know exactly what form it's going to take yet.
Would a reprisal towards decentralized finance be bad for Bitcoin? Because it would say, oh, all of crypto is in the crosshairs, or would it be good in the sense that non-Bitcoin crypto is largely viewed as a regulatory arbitrage play that then gets stamped out?
It's a great question because Bitcoin is not the dominant collateral type in decentralized finance, although it is somewhat involved. Any reprisals might concern platforms or exchanges where, of course, Bitcoin trades as well, and it might affect the liquidity profile. But it's a good point. Bitcoin is somewhat distinct from the broader decentralized finance movement. That said, I think investor pessimism would percolate throughout the whole industry and probably adversely affect Bitcoin at the same time.
Currently, we are experiencing a severe correction on the crypto market. Bitcoin is also clearly feeling this. But Bitcoin's current plunge is dwarfed by the sharp trading losses, the collapse of El Salvador's bonds, which has driven up El Salvador's financing cost. The country's foreign bonds posted the world's worst performance in 2021, as investors were spooked by Bukele's unorthodox economic management and the Bitcoin experiment. Extended fund financing with the help of the International Monetary Fund has not materialized due to multilateral lenders' concerns about Bitcoin. Bukele has become a celebrity in the Bitcoin community for buying on price drops and promising to build a tax-free Bitcoin city on the country's coast. What do analysts think of this buying the dip strategy by the president?
Hey, Charlie, I want to start with you because you wrote about retail traders buying the dip. Is there patience with Bitcoin volatility? Is it wearing a little bit thin?
Well, with some of them. So anytime you see Bitcoin or other, meme assets start to decline, you see this barrage of tweets, of Facebook posts, of Reddit posts saying, quote unquote, buy the dip. And a lot of retail investors by this point in the year have bought some of these dips, but they've only seen dips continue and they've lost money. So with a number of the people that I spoke with, including a woman who lost about $2,000 buying a dip that kept dipping, yes, there is a loss of patience here.
And so, Vildana, let's talk about exactly what happened yesterday, because I was off, but it seemed like it was really bad. And I noticed in your story, you had a detail in there that some $3.7 billion of crypto liquidations occurred in 24 hours. What does that mean? Were people basically being forced out of their positions?
Yeah, so the decline yesterday was really precipitous. It was so incredibly quick. I think a lot of people had been watching the charts and maybe guessing that Bitcoin was going to hit 50,000 yesterday and cross above it. And then in a matter of minutes, you saw it just decline. It wiped out 10%, then 15%, then 17%. So certainly you had some people who maybe aren't hodlers, meaning they're not holding on for dear life, and maybe potentially they got scared and some of them sold out of their positions. But at the same time, you had these really interesting statistics about these liquidations. Basically what happens is somebody can borrow money and make bets on cryptocurrencies, and when those bets go wrong, your positions can actually get liquidated. So I was looking at data from this company called Bybit. They track some of these trends, and so they saw that some 330,000 of these traders were liquidated yesterday, and that amounted to more than $3.5 billion worth of cryptocurrencies in yesterday's sell-off. So huge numbers, really precipitous decline, and you have sort of a lot of these things at play, but certainly these liquidations were a big part of yesterday's decline.
Well, what's so interesting, Vildana and Charlie, is it came on the day that El Salvador adopted Bitcoin as legal tender. So Charlie, I know you were watching this closely because this was a very big test for the idea of this being a, cryptocurrency, or at least legal tender in a country. What did you learn about the rollout, the implementation of it, and what that had to do with yesterday's decline? Was there any relationship with the sell-off that we saw there and what happened in El Salvador?
Yeah, so the tweets really tell the story here. So this was billed as one of the biggest tests for Bitcoin, that, a country, albeit small, was going to start accepting Bitcoin as legal tender. The president was touting this. There was, quite widespread opposition, but this was seen as a test for Bitcoin as a currency that could be accepted in, retailers. And so before this happened, a number of Bitcoin supporters across social media talked about how they wanted to try to boost this in a sort of meme-y way. People were buying $30 worth of Bitcoin, which is the amount of money that people in El Salvador were going to be given. And this was, hoping to support this rollout. There were technical issues that we saw very quickly and a lot of disappointment. And so, potential causation, or at least correlation there, connected to the drop yesterday and what people were seeing in El Salvador.
El Salvador is thus the first country in the world to adopt Bitcoin as a legal currency. The country has been using the US dollar for more than 20 years and continues its Bitcoin-friendly course in 2022. The government has once again injected several $1 million into the controversial cryptocurrency. Likewise, El Salvador is planning to build Bitcoin City, the world's first Bitcoin city. Bitcoin City is to be built in the eastern area of La Union. President Nayib Bukele recently announced it will be powered by a nearby volcano. Bukele said the planned city will be financed with bonds that are also tied to virtual currencies. The announcement was made during an event at the country's week-long Latin American Bitcoin and Blockchain Conference. Samsung Mao, who attended the event along with Bukele, said, in addition, El Salvador plans to issue $1 billion worth of Bitcoin bonds in 2022. Ma is an executive at Blockstream, a blockchain technology provider. Once funding is in place, construction of Bitcoin City could begin within 60 days, Bukele said. Ma added that this city could make El Salvador the financial center of the world. The government said it will provide land, infrastructure, and low taxes to attract investors. Bukele said there will be no poverty, income, or municipal taxes, only value-added tax. The government also already operates a Bitcoin mining test project. It is located near another geothermal area next to the Ticapa volcano in the eastern part of the country. The government plans to use about half of the tax revenue to fund Bitcoin City. The other half will be used for local services. Bukele estimated that the public infrastructure projects will cost about 300,000 Bitcoins. The government currency supports Bitcoin with a 150 million fund. To encourage Salvadorans to use Bitcoin, the government offered a $30 credit with the use of digital wallets. Bitcoin was originally created to operate outside of government-controlled financial systems. Whether cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin can really solve major problems of our current financial system remains to be seen. El Salvador has dared to take the step into the future. Will other countries follow suit?